It's not a full room and we have a lot of space, so at least we won't fall asleep. Okay. My presentation is going to, I'm going to just start with a little bit of contextual information and ideas, and then go more into the urban child labor situation. So we have heard since yesterday that the recent global report of the ILO has given us some good news that 78 million, today there are 78 million less children in child labor than there were in 2000. But we also heard that leaves us 168 million 5 to 17 years old in child labor, 85 million of these in hazardous child labor, which is just unacceptable. Just to sort of pin down what we mean by child labor in this context, it is work that deprives children of their childhood potential and dignity and is harmful to their physical, mental, and moral mental development and moral well-being. It is work by children below the minimum working age as specified in the ILO Convention on Minimum Age, number 138, and work that is among the worst forms of child labor as based on the ILO Worst Forms of Child Labor Convention 182. We heard our ILO Director General say, unless efforts are stepped up, the goals that the world community set for itself in 2006 and then reaffirmed in 2010 at the Hague Conference, we are very far from those goals. The report also tells us that a large number of the children, 59%, are in the rural agricultural sector. So, I think this went back. So why do we need to focus on urban settings, urban child labor? Well, generally speaking, the urban population growth is tremendous. 60 million people are added every year. By 2050, 7 in 10 people will live in cities and towns. Children born into existing urban populations constitute 60% of the urban growth. This is above and beyond the children who are added to the urban population as a result of migration from rural to urban areas. There are too many children, far too many children, who are invisible in the urban settings, who are sunk in a world of deprivation and child poverty, and who, as a result of inadequate or unimplemented policies and programs, fall through the cracks into a jungle of endless violence against them. The good part in the urban sector is that there is a body of legislation. There is more in terms of policies and legislation, even for children in the urban area as compared to the rural agriculture area, where there are so many unknowns and the unclarity in terms of legislation and mandates and the enforcers. But again, it is seldom implemented effectively. Almost half of the world's children, not child laborers, children, are in the urban areas. urban areas can be as little as areas with 2,000 population to 50,000 to millions, 30 million, 20 million, 34 million. We find that most growth in the urban areas is in cities and towns in Asia and Africa. Asia, as you will recall, has the largest numbers of child laborers in the world, and Africa has the highest incidence. So it is a matter of concern if we are not paying attention to the urban areas. Slums and illegal dwellings are a major breeding ground for child labor. More than 6 in 10 Africans who live in urban areas reside in slums. This is data from Child Helpline International and their national affiliates. Oops. And as you can see, the center yellow line there is children used for begging. So children who are begging on the streets. They have called in, many of them, to complain about their situation. The other one is domestic child labor. Now, while this data is not split into urban or rural, the nature of the work that the children are involved in indicates that many of them are in the urban areas. Now, what is it that children are involved in child labor in the urban areas? We find them at little restaurants, mobile ones, with carts, preparing food on using gas stove or some sort of fuel. We find them begging right in the middle of traffic on streets. We find them down the lanes in the cities and towns in little workshops where there's hardly enough room to sit up straight. We find the children manufacturing items, different processes of manufacturing that are split up outside of factories, and they're very much involved in it. We find them in domestic labor. We find them in hotels and restaurants. Here, the kid is cleaning the room. And we find them in CSEC activities and many, many others. These are kids who are preparing, manufacturing spoons, cutlery. And they sleep anywhere they can find a place. Now, a lot of the sweatshirt shops that there are in the urban areas. A lot of the CSEC illicit activities that take place on the streets are in the urban areas. From trafficking of drugs and other illegal substances where children act as carriers to actually being victims of these activities. Now, this table is from a study by UN Habitat on youth. And there are a lot of voices of youth and their ideas of what they think make their cities prosperous, what make their cities less prosperous, don't give them opportunities. In this particular table, we have what is the youth saying about gender inequality in the cities. And the primary concern shown here is lack of employment. There's unequal access to education that they're concerned about. Where the youth live, they live in slums, in illegal dwellings, and of course, they have also noted that there is, in many places, weak civil society to defend their rights. In the graph on the far right side on the top, you see the number of children in regionally. And the bottom one, the yellow one, is Asia and the Pacific. And then you see here, this is from the youth survey, that this is all Asia, different parts of Asia. This is South Asia, but this is all the different Asia. So what happens to the children who are in child labor? 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, they're in the pool of youth then. And if they have been uneducated, unskilled, they will take that to the next cycle in their lives. Now, what are the main pathways out of child labor and deprivation for urban children? Social protection and decent work, certainly. If the parents have the means and the resources to put their children to school, if the children are not sent out to work, every time there is an illness in the family or there is an event that needs to be covered, it helps to get the children out of poverty. I remember talking to a young lady who asked me the question. In fact, she made the statement that if there is a woman and she's sick and she has an 8-year-old, isn't it obvious that the 8-year-old should be working? And I said, of course, the 8-year-old should not be working. What happened to the community? What happened to the government? What happened to the church and all the other religious institutions? Why does a kid have to bear the burden of the sickness of the mother? But in reality, that is what happens. There is a lot of migration, rural to urban, and much of the time it is not protected either at the point of departure or the point of where the children end up. Sometimes even when they go with parents, we have seen at construction sites in cities and around cities, what is happening to the children. They're just on the roadside. They are not in school. They do not receive the services. So whether they migrate on their own as very young or whether they migrate with their families, they need protection. There needs to be protective legislation to cover these children so that they're able to take advantage of the education system and as well as other services. Education is an obvious pathway out of urban child labor and urban poverty. And what we have, the ILO has recommended an experience that works well is for the younger children, after they've received some transitional education, to be what we call mainstreamed into regular schools. And this is important because some countries do have dual or triple education tracks where the regular children go to one type of school and through one system, and then the others stay in on a second track. What is important, if there is a second track, that it not be second-class education for second-class citizens. that all children receive equal quality of education. For the older children, skills training is absolutely critical. And it is this that is going to break the cycle from child labor to unemployed or underemployed youth. We know what is happening with youth worldwide today. Many of them are educated youth who just do not have jobs in the current economies. But many of them are also children who started and ended their childhood as in child labor. There are many different programs in the world that are working well on this as well. The work-to-work transitions or the school-to-work transitions that provide skills and training and the soft skills that are needed, that also provide linkages to employment or counseling, apprenticeships that are sort of decent apprenticeships and don't end up in child labor. So this is, in terms of the pathway out of urban child labor and child poverty, is social protection and decent work for families, protective and productive migration for the young and the adults, education, and skills training. Now, what are some of the strategies that work? Some of the strategies that we have seen in the field that have impact. The first, of course, is understanding the problem, the scale and nature of urban poverty and exclusion affecting children. In many parts of the world, exclusion, discrimination based on class, on class, they're very, very significant factors. And they're more pronounced in urban areas than perhaps in rural. There need to be broad-based and diverse and targeted partnerships. When we talk about the urban setting, the absolutely crucial, critical partnership is with the municipalities, with the city corporations, with whoever is responsible for the time, for the town. I got the time card, so. So, it is not easy. You know, many times we go to the, when we are talking to the departments of labor in countries or in cities and towns, and as soon as you start to talk about street children, they will tell you, but that's not us. Somebody else is dealing with that, another ministry. Now, what children need is seamless protection. It doesn't matter which department, which ministry. We have to make it seamless for them. Otherwise, it's no good. So we, in fact, had a project in Bangladesh that worked with the Dhaka City Corporation. It took very long to get the partnerships going and to get it was new for the city corporation to be dealing with something like that directly. But it showed very good results. And in fact, even within the city corporation, then there are different sections and elements that need to be brought on board so that they can own the problem and they can set their strategies. They may not be strategies that give us excellent examples of little islands of excellence, but they are strategies that can work in their systems, and that is important. Removing barriers to exclusion and inclusion. And housing is a big issue in the urban setting. The entitlement to housing, the ownership of housing, it provides security. The other point is to address child labor right from the onset, not in the end. Where is urban planning taking place? Where is the planning of infrastructure taking place? The planning of schools and centers and services. That is where child labor needs to be addressed if it is going to be addressed in a sustainable way. And integrated processes and systems, like I said, the protection for children has to be seamless. It doesn't matter which department or which NGO or who gives it, they need to receive the services. So somebody needs to coordinate. Somebody needs to coordinate all the work that is going on there and bring in the work that is not going on there. I have a few, okay. The other thing is a lot of us, when we go in as a program, when we go into support programs, we have donor funding, and many of our programs are, 3 to 4 to 5 years. This really isn't sufficient time for action to root, to set in, to show results, and to sustain. I know there are a lot of issues involved in this, and it's not easy. But I think sometimes short duration projects that end in the middle of what they're supposed to do can do more harm than good. So we need to be realistic when we're setting up projects. Do they have enough duration to take it to conclusion for this part, that the city can then take it on, somebody can take it on and continue? Or is the period so short that we need to do something that is more feasible? Lessons, adapting lessons from other places, from other regions, of course, is very critical. There are some good examples in the urban setting. Like I mentioned, we have had some successes in the Dhaka City Corporation project. There are others, but they need to be adapted to local conditions and not just imported. Another very important point is transforming abusive apprenticeships to decent apprenticeships so that they're truly pathways out of poverty and child labor. The legislation, many countries have some sort of legislation on apprenticeships, but it often is not updated, at least in South Asia, where I work currently. There has been an attempt by some countries to update the legislation to make it consistent. Otherwise, what happens is the apprenticeships are just another form of child labor. Mobilizing employers and the private sector to get involved in the transition to a work program is absolutely critical, because the apprenticeships and other schemes cannot take place without the involvement, meaningful involvement of employers and the private sector. Codes of conducts, they have some value, especially if they're implemented, they can be very valuable. We find that when cities are faced with organizing and hosting big events, sporting events or other events, that is the time that they sort of gear up and should be encouraged to develop codes of conduct for their hotels and for their transport and other sectors. I find that it is all the programs that work best and have good results and are sustainable are the ones that are simple, that are indigenous, that have learning from outside, but that are really rooted in their indigenous sort of, the better part of what we have as indigenous environment. And good governance, coordination, capacity development. Of course, without these, we can have the best of programs and the best of intentions and policies, but they will not make a dime of a difference. Policy implications, the overarching policy, I believe, is mainstreaming, because nobody really has sufficient budget to set up everything specifically for child labor in response to it, or it is much more easier and it is more sustainable to have everybody take responsibility for child labor. It is everybody's business. It is everybody's responsibility, and it is everybody's failure if it doesn't work. So integrating it into the TVET, the technical, vocational, and education policies and programs of education, social and child protection, everything that a city needs to function. Codes for child-friendly cities, what gives safe and secure spaces for children to have recreation, to develop, to do stuff. A justice system that works for the children, that is child-friendly, that knows and is keen to implement what their laws are. And what's also interesting is that taxation policies in some instances can lead to child labor situations. In some countries, when the industry gets very heavily taxed, and it sort of splits up into different units of production and a long supply chain, that is where child labor comes in. So before policies are put in place, before cities are developed, there need to be assessments and feasibility studies of what would the impact be on children. Before large-scale programs for small micro home-based enterprises are funded and come into existence, there need to be studies on the impact of those on children. Are children going to be taken out of school to work on those, on whatever is being produced or prepared, or to take up other chores? And then, of course, adequate allocation in budgets and ratification implementation of the conventions. Thank you.